So I'm Zosia Zaks. It's nice to meet all of you. I am an autistic adult. I also am a counselor and have worked with hundreds and hundreds of teenagers and young adults on the autism spectrum over the past 20 years. And I also teach autism classes, but it's not classes like, oh, this is what autism is, and this is what you need to do to fix autistic people. Instead, we're looking at autism through a social justice lens and finding out why society has not treated us so well and what we can do to fix that, which mostly involves getting non-autistic people to be more tolerant and to value diversity. So I often am involved in projects that bring non-autistic people and autistic people together so they can get to know each other and so that the non-autistic people can start following what the autistic people say would help to fix the world. So that's in a nutshell what I have been very busy doing over the last few years. I also conduct research and do sort of brainiac things like that because my mind has to stay very busy. Otherwise, I um, get anxious. I just conducted a study where I interviewed autistic clinicians and professionals. So that means like there are out there in the world, for example, therapists who are autistic or teachers who are autistic. And I wanted to find out from them what they think we should be doing because there's been a big change in the world. In the old days, if you went to a therapist or an occupational therapist or special education teacher to get some help, pretty much almost all the time, what they would try to do is make you, as normal as possible. That's what they were trying to do, you know. And a lot of autistic people, starting with the self-advocacy movement, probably around the 1990s, started to say, no, don't do that. That's really awful. First of all, what is normal anyway? Because everybody is different. But then also it just like really hurts our feelings, like what are you saying? Like the way that we are isn't good or something. So we have really fought to try to get people to stop making us normal, but unfortunately it still happens a lot. And there's research now showing that when we pressure autistic people to try to be like so-called normal people, it can really hurt us. It can make us very depressed. It can make us really anxious. So we really want to stop doing that. But the question is, okay, so how do we get professionals to stop doing that? I said, well, let me go ask autistic professionals because maybe they have some wisdom here. So that's another example of a project that I've been doing. I'm older than I look. So I remember not the very first days of the self-advocacy movement, but I found out I was autistic in the late 1990s. And back then, you know, I don't want to be dismissive. We still have a lot of work to do. The world is, I was just talking about some projects that I'm doing to try to make the world better. But we have made some progress. Back then, almost nobody was talking about neurodiversity. Almost nobody was talking about being autistic and how it's okay to be different, and that we should, build an inclusive society. That really wasn't a hot topic of conversation. Now you can go online and you see these conversations all over the place, and maybe people are, still having some disagreements, but at least we're talking about it. So back then it was very, very few people were having these kind of conversations. Um, and I thought I might share with you sort of how it felt back then. Um, I'm very proud of the fact that I'm autistic and I have no problem with being autistic. But back then, when I first got diagnosed, I was an adult. It made a lot of sense. Like suddenly, okay, now all these problems I had my whole life. Okay, now I realize it wasn't because I wasn't trying or something like that. There was a name for my experiences. So it wasn't bad getting diagnosed. But like I said, so few people were talking about it that I was almost kind of like scared to come out as autistic. It was easier for me to come out as queer. You know, I thought that if I came out as autistic, people would judge me. or they wouldn't give me a job, or they wouldn't want to go on a date with me. So I was very scared. But then I found that there were autistic people who were getting together at a conference in upstate New York called AUTREAT, and they got together every summer. Um, so I was very excited. I said, okay, well, I'll go and I'll see what's going on there. And I sort of call this my first moment in sort of the self-advocacy mindset. Back in those days, also, again, going along with that idea of let's try to make these autistic people, quote unquote, as normal as possible. People were saying that if you went on a gluten-free, casein-free diet, it would cure your autism. Okay. I mean, now we may, as a subset of people, have more digestive issues. I think people are checking on this, and you may feel better if you need a special diet, but it doesn't make people unautistic, you know. I know I certainly learn better and communicate better when my body's feeling good. So it makes sense that um, special diet might help some people. I don't know. They're investigating. But like I said, it doesn't suddenly make you quote unquote normal. But anyway, it was big. It was very popular. And so when I got to AUTREAT, there was somebody there at the entrance helping everybody to go inside. And I was trying to figure out what to do and where to go and where I was going to be sleeping. And I was just curious, but I said to this person at the table, um, do you know, does the conference have gluten-free, casein-free food? And they said, yes. However, you'll probably run into a lot of autistics here who will tell you that if a grilled cheese sandwich makes them autistic, they'll take two grilled cheese sandwiches. And that was a real wake up, like light bulb moment to me. Like, wow, people are actually cool with this. And that person that I was talking to actually was Jim Sinclair, which I don't know if some of you have heard of them, but they um, uh, were tremendous in moving the conversation. And they weren't the only person who started the self-advocacy movement, but they were certainly one of those early leaders. Um, and I encourage you to read their writing, and it's all over the internet. Great articles and pieces that really got people to start thinking, hey, that's not tragic being autistic. It's just being different, and we can help autistic people. But frankly, all humans need help, so that's not like a bad thing to need help. Humans just need different kinds of help at different times in their life. Um, and we can depathologize is the fancy word, make it not like it's this huge big terrible problem to be different. So he was really really instrumental in that, and so I always tell a grilled cheese story. That was kind of like my first moment into this world of, hey, I don't have to be scared or embarrassed. I can just come out as autistic and it's fine. And so I started to get involved with the self-advocacy movement, and uh, began talking about my experiences, and joining with other autistic people in um, trying to get society to see neurodiversity as an asset, actually. And that kind of ties into the second thing that I'll bring up, and then maybe we'll open it up for some questions, because I don't like just sitting here talking. I like to talk with people. But the other thing that I have run into over the years is something called critical disability theory. Some people might have heard critical race theory. Well, it's similar. And basically, you can do studies on autism, or you can do recommendations. Like, for example, you'll see reports that will say, oh, we could do all these things and help autistic people get jobs, right? And that could be very valuable if you want a job. A lot of people want a job, they want to work, they like meeting their coworkers, they like feeling like they're contributing to society. But you see, critical disability theory says, well, wait a second, that's fine if you want to help autistic people get jobs, especially if autistic people say they want to get jobs. But um, why do we work the way that we do? Why is there so much discrimination in workplaces? Should we all be working 9 to 5 and being exhausted all the time? Are there other ways that people can contribute to their communities besides just producing profit and getting paid to do that? So not to belabor it, but the takeaway point here is another aspect of what I think I'm doing is trying to get people to see that it's not just a fluffy, nice thing like, oh, let's be kind to the autistic people. What I'm trying to get people to see is that society needs different kinds of brains. We need all different kinds of brains because that pushes us to keep innovating and keep questioning what we're doing and why. Why do we organize life this way? Maybe there's better ways. Maybe there's more inclusive ways. Maybe there's less discriminatory ways. So when we have diversity in a community, it sparks those questions and it gets society to keep growing and moving and learning. And so if disabled people were blocked from society like they used to be, we wouldn't have an opportunity to ask these questions. And the last point I want to make is that sometimes people think, well, the neurodiversity movement only has to do with autistic people who can speak and are more independent. But I want to underscore that that's not true. Okay. And we're not putting disabled people back on some special pedestal, like, oh, we should be nice because they teach us something. Like, that's gross. We don't like that. Um, what I'm saying is that sometimes it can be very frustrating, and I want to acknowledge that. We don't have to always be, oh, this is rosy, this is wonderful, this is my superpower. It can be really frustrating if you want to communicate and you can't, or if you're trying to make friends and not be lonely and that's not working. Like it can be very, very hard. What I'm saying is that it's out of our frustration that we start asking those questions and trying to find new ways to do things. So, for example, when it's really, really frustrating to make a friend, we don't have to deny how frustrating that is, but we can start to ask questions like, in this society, typically, you know, at least by observation, okay, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm not right 100% of the time, but by careful observation, most people think being friends is like, oh, you go and you chat and you do all these, very social activities, like at really loud bars or clubs, So, I mean, and here I'm being a little over generalistic just to give an example. You know, maybe this is an opportunity to talk about, are there other ways to be friends? A lot of autistic people succeed better at connecting to other people socially by sharing our special interests in info dumping. You might have heard about that. All right. Also, who says you have to chat and go for coffee? Why can't you go look at, um, you know, enormous dumpsters crushing trash at the local landfill? That sounds a lot more interesting to me, right? So that's what I'm saying. We don't have to deny that it's frustrating. It doesn't have to be all rosy all the time, but it's that opportunity to question and find new ways of living together and new ways of loving each other. And we lose that when we exclude autistic people. So that's where I think the neurodiversity movement applies to everybody. I'll tell one more quick story. I was doing at Towson University service learning class for many years, where my mostly non-autistic students would do interesting projects and activities with autistic adults, like I said, so they can get to know each other and learn from each other and listen to the autistic people about how to make things better. And one of my students was in a fitness program with autistic adults and was tasked to go work out with an autistic adult who does not use speech. And the student came running back to me and said, "You said I'm supposed to get to know this person, but they don't talk. So this is not fair. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." And I said, "Well, wait a minute. The only way to be friends is to chat. Like, go find new ways to connect to human beings." So it's an opportunity for non-autistic people to grow also, you know. So that's a little bit more about me. Um, Anyone have any questions or things that maybe you want me to talk more about?
Well, I tried to email one of my old friends from school, and he never responds to my emails.
I'm very sorry to hear that. It's hard for me to speak to that specific situation because I don't know this other person. It's possible they could just be busy or that their email changed. Like I said, it can be very, very frustrating. Um, I hope you have an opportunity to maybe explore connecting to other people in other ways. Sometimes a friendship does end or people move on or they grow up and go on to do different things, but there's always a chance to go somewhere new and meet new people. So stay hopeful. That would be my one message.
I understand that.
It doesn't always have to be the same age. It doesn't even have to be the same species. My cat is probably my best friend. He and I hang out. He listens to me. He doesn't mind hanging out at 3 o'clock in the morning when I can't sleep. He's like, "Yeah, sure, okay, I'll play mouse with you, you know." So, I mean, I think most humans do want to connect to other humans at least a little bit. But don't forget the animals too. They can be really good friends.
I'm so glad that you're talking specifically about this issue with friends. So I'll put that in quotes, right? Because we can't have a universal definition of what that looks like and what that means to individuals. Um, and I just kind of remember growing up, in I think like in the 90s or turn of the century, that sitcom Friends. Uh,
Mm,
And I remember thinking to myself, is this how humans are supposed to interact with other humans? It is kind of what you said in the beginning is that um well, multiple times, that connecting with other living things, whether it be other human beings, whether it be animals, or even like plants or nature in general, is it's a very personal experience for the individual, and I think, I mean, part of the huge problem, probably even with the notion of friends, is that, we've sort of been, um, we're taught this narrative or the script, of what that's supposed to look like. You mentioned the things like, oh yeah, people going out to bars and going out to the clubs, noisy environments, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that, um, when I was like in my 20s, like everyone around me, this is kind of what they thought about when friends spent time together. So if you weren't like that, then does that mean that you're ineligible for friendship? And that's completely, of course, bogus. But I do think that this idea that, people are trying to sort of standardize the definition of, meaningful relationship, or, even, or what people consider a friend, is kind of dangerous, because I mean, for everyone, include, especially like if how you interact with people is not in the mainstream.
hmm Well, yeah, and I think just going off that idea for a minute, how you said it can be dangerous is one way that I see it can be dangerous is that a lot of times, and not just with friendships, but also with relationships or even not necessarily romantic relationships, but for example, relationship between a student and a teacher, um, because for many of us, doing what's promoted as the normal way to socialize or be friends or be in relationship with others. So what tends to happen is autistic people are blamed as if, they, it's not just that it's hard to explain what I'm saying. In a relationship, so let's say society says things are supposed to go a certain way, and you can't do that. People might react and say, "Oh, you see, you ruin all the fun times," or you just can't handle relationships, or I guess other people's feelings or whatever don't matter to you. None of that's true. It's just that there's an incompatibility. It's almost like people are talking two different languages. If you find people who sort of operate similarly to you, you could do really well in a relationship. So it's and what I'm getting at is we too quickly blame the autism. It's not the autism, it's just compatibility. And I do think that autistic and non-autistic friends can autistic and non-autistic people can be friends too. I'm not saying that never happens, but when that's successful is when both are compromising and being very explicit and non-judgmental. So, if the autistic person is free to say, "Oh, I see you want me to come to your birthday party, but that's going to be really overwhelming and too loud. I can't deal with bars." The non-autistic person doesn't take it personally. They don't say, "Oh, you're not celebrating my birthday. You must not like me." They're just like, "Oh, okay. Some people don't deal well with loud environments. How about you and me? We go out, just the two of us, for a walk in the park, and then I'll feel like you're celebrating your birthday with me and you care about me because you're making time for me, but you don't have to show up at the loud bar, so we're meeting each other's needs." So I think when that can happen explicitly, um there's a lot of possibility for friendship. I wrote about that too, like to just how we have to stop blaming the autism and just um find people who like doing the things we like to do and who understand us and are willing or are willing to make compromises, which frankly any two humans are gonna have to anyway. No matter how compatible you are, there's still always going to be a few things you got to compromise.
I like that you brought up your cat as one of your friends. Um, I love animals, and they're always the top of my list. But my idea of friendship, I mean, when I'm sitting there, I meditate a lot, and to me, the universe feels just as much alive and like a friend, um, as any person would. So I have lots of feelings for, I don't know, I just feel really connected to everything. And it's, I used to have a lot of empathy. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. I really appreciated you mentioning that because animals have been some of my best friends. And art. Love art.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's many, many ways to feel connected and to be plugged in. Um, you mentioned empathy, so that just got my brain thinking off in that direction. Um, and I really want to dispel that myth too, because we hear that a lot, like, "Oh, autistic people are not empathetic." In fact, I think we're so empathetic, that's why we shut down,
Absolutely.
because we can we feel everything, on a real level.
It's definitely hard to learn not to feel when you're a little kid. To not feel, but to learn to not be overwhelmed by feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was very, very, very sensitive all my life. But I also noticed so much more than other people seem to notice. Um, I, so I think part of that was just processing so much um, more feelings, more data, more. Um, I saw the world a lot deeper, I think, than most people did.
Mm-hmm. I also think that again, we tend to use these non-autistic standards like we were just talking about for friendship. So people will say, for example, deeply connecting to somebody else, they call it reciprocity. And it looks like they're looking at each other, and one person says some information, and then the other person says other information. And so they're going back and forth and deeply attuned to whatever the topic is between them. And yeah, okay, that's one form of deep reciprocity. but there are other forms. So I have seen neurodivergent people, for example, I call it co-stimming. So they'll be sitting together. They may not necessarily be looking at each other, but maybe they're watching the patterns of the sun coming through the window, and they're both checking out the patterns, and they're just like kind of in a zone together. That they're really sharing this. They're really sharing this experience, but it doesn't necessarily look like textbook reciprocity.
That's so funny because I was sitting there thinking to myself, the reason why I think I always picked up much more before you said patterns was that I was a pattern person. I would just pick up patterns, and then all of a sudden you said that, and I went, "Oh, he's so intuitive."
We can be very intuitive and sensitive, and we can share very, deep reciprocity with other people. It just looks different. I've seen, especially young children, neurodivergent children, if you give them the space to do so, they will co-stim, and it's just so beautiful to see them jointly stimming on a pattern or a color or even a toy. Like they'll just be in their zone with it. It's very beautiful.
When I was young, my sister was at Mansfield Training Center, and every time you went to go see her, there was just a warehouse, and at least that part of Mansfield, that was just a warehouse with mattresses. But people, all the people with autism were dressed in straitjackets, and the only contact they had with people was if they fell over, they'd straighten them back up again. And it was just, I couldn't believe the inhumanity that existed, because nobody would do that to anybody else. It would have been illegal, and yet at that time you could do things like that to a person with autism and never even try to reach the person inside. I mean, it was basically okay to strap you down or strap you up and have no contact with you except for to straighten you up and change a diaper once in a while. And I will never forget that.
Yeah, you speak to a very horrible time period in history where autistic people and other disabled people were basically not viewed as human beings. So if something, their viewpoint then is that, well, they're not human, so they don't have the same feelings, they don't have the same needs, so it doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter if they lack care and contact and joyful experiences and enough food and warmth and all these things because they're not human. So it was a very, very terrible time period. And that's what I was speaking to, is that I think we've made some progress, but we still have a lot of like what I call attitude work to do. So unfortunately, there's still a lot of pressure to try to be normal or get this kid to act normal. And we know now how harmful that is. So I think that's still some of the last work that we're doing, is to see us as fully human.
As normal.
Yeah, well, and you know, just I personally think we should get away from words like normal.
Well, yeah, yeah.
The history has been so bad. Um, and just, accept that we're all human and that it's natural for humans to be all different. We're all different shapes, sizes, colors, brain interests, abilities, challenges, frustrations. And like I was saying earlier, that's not you know, um, that doesn't mean we have to deny trouble. It can be very frustrating in our life. But like I said, that is an opportunity for everybody to grow and really think maybe we could be doing things differently, and maybe we could be doing things better or more justly. I like to see it as a frustration as kind of a doorway into discovery.
What's amazing to me is that my youngest brother has autism, and he he never really knew how to reach out and connect with everybody else in the family. we tried, but he just kind of like was in his own world and really into whatever he was reading, or and then all of a sudden he just became the most incredible social butterfly. It's like one day he just really wanted to communicate, and it's been absolutely fabulously interesting to connect with him. What an experience after all these years.
That can happen. Sometimes it doesn't, but even people who are in their own world, um, I I I invite people to consider, like I was saying earlier, like new forms of connecting, because sometimes even someone just like sitting near you, and they're present, like their presence is kind of a connection. So I just didn't want to lose the train of that, but it kind of connects to what you were just saying, Roger, which is that, there's just such a pressure on all of us. Um, and I think, yeah, it comes out of socialization. I also think, and here I'm gonna open up sort of, I'm gonna mention this topic, but to go into it very deeply would be a whole entire workshop on itself. So I'm just gonna say very briefly, I I um, hypothesize that this pressure to normalize is fairly recent in human history, and it is tied, um, to Western, very Western notions about what a human being should be doing or what a human being should be like, um, and gets very, very connected to what we've seen over the last 200 years with colonialization and racism and sexism, and the ableism is all tied up in that. So again, I could talk about that all day, but what I'm hoping to do right in this quick, brief sentence is just plant the seed that, um, everybody, including non-autistic, non-neurodivergent people, asking these questions, um, is actually really tied to social justice. And when we start to sit down and say, wait, why are we putting all this pressure on each other to be a certain way? It's deeply connected to what kind of world we have and what kind of world we rather have.
Can you recommend any good books on that topic or movies?
This is a good book here, Care Work. Oh, it's backwards in the I forgot. It always comes backwards. There's a lot of, autistic and other neurodivergent authors who are writing books, about how questioning normalization and fighting for justice for neurodivergent people really is a call to change the world. And then I'll also, give you a link to an article that I wrote, and it's free online, so you don't have to pay for it. And there is audio. So if you need an audio version instead of reading it, the audio version is there. And it's an academic article, but I don't write in very dense language, so it's easy to read. And the title of it is Changing the Medical Model of Disability to the Normalization Model of Disability, Creating the Past to Create a New Future Direction. And essentially, in this article, that's what I try to do. I try to pull this history out, like where did this normalization come from, and why it's so toxic, and how we can, start talking about it, and hopefully get society to switch gears, not just for neurodivergent people, but for everybody and even for the planet.
Yeah, I can. My whole school life, I can remember kindergarten through first grade was pure hell just because of not feeling normal, and other people picking up on that. Just the more sensitivity and stuff like that. And I know that as soon as everybody picked up on it socially, My life was hell after that. But it didn't bother me because I liked being who I was. But it still, they made it memorable.
In the previous meeting was talking about the bullying and the really cruel treatment in their schools, and I'm thinking like, how do how do people learn how to be that way? Was that kind of taught to them, um, or is this sort of what some kids just do? They don't really know better.
I think the word normalization like hits it right on the nail head.
If kids detect something that's out of the norm, then they automatically or reflexively become aggressive and like unkind.
Yeah, that's all I ever saw growing up in public school.
Yeah, that's a little scary.
I don't think that human beings automatically are born judgmental or experiencing this normalization pressure in their socialization. It has a lot to do with the context of the particular society that we're living in. And I think what happens is that children are like sponges. And so they pick up the priorities of the society that they live in.
Mm-hmm.
As they're being raised and socialized, and they're watching TV and they're seeing all the messages and the messages that come through in the materials that they're given at school and to play with, all of those, it's like a soup. And, so that whole soup, it translates into a certain kind of child being a certain kind of way. But I think that we can sort of disrupt it and derail it precisely by having conversations like this and by professionals, teachers, parents, really working hard to bring this stuff to a conscious level and have conversations with children, and not in a fluffy way like let's be nice to the sad different kids. No, it's talking about how important it is for humanity to have all different kinds of brains. And going back to that conversation about opportunity, that child in your class who doesn't speak, that's a great opportunity for you to figure out how to have a friend that doesn't, that you don't have conversations. What else can you do with human beings? And not that non-speaking people don't have conversations, but I mean, like in a broad way, they're going to be communicating very differently than sitting down and chatting over a cup of coffee. So it's an opportunity for you, the quote unquote non-disabled child, to grow and learn and stretch. So not having pity conversations, but having those conversations about the real value of this difference to everybody. And I think that that's how we can sort of start to push back against some of that. I mean, I do think to a degree, kids, sometimes I'll give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, which is that because they are children and they're not mature, sometimes they do say, ha ha, look at that person who, and they don't know. But so I don't want to shame children or childhood, you know. So that's always going to happen a little bit, but I think that's where if we can come in and say, well, yeah, you notice that they're different, but we want to approach it, in this new way,
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of thinking about how a lot of kids are raised. It's you gotta like there's all these rules you have to learn. You gotta you have to have manners and etiquette, and I guess that a lot of that stuff is almost like you have to conform to a norm, and if you don't, then you're like harshly reprimanded, or it's almost like you get negatively reinforced, if there's a difference, so I guess maybe how we how we teach children fundamentally has to change, because if deviating from norm means punishment for a little kid, that's I think that's kind of how a lot of people address parenting. It's like, you do something that's unacceptable or out of the norm, and you get negatively reinforced for that. But at the same time, when you're that little, say like you're a tiny kid, you don't have maybe your capacity to reason or to understand nuance is not fully developed. So maybe that's why people end up doing stuff like that. But and maybe there has to be more of a conscious effort, to sort of start changing tracks. When you need to establish a norm, and then when is it not necessary or harmful? Because we could probably
Well,
all agree that you shouldn't be assaultive to people, but
well,
that shouldn't be tolerated. But there's other things that are very much in the gray area.
I think that like with my brother when he went, um, they had really troubled kids in there who, for whatever reasons, and then they had special needs kids. So so there were kids in there who were violent and in trouble, and so and it was the same thing with special ed in school. Um, the kids who were in a lot of trouble ended up in there, and the kids with special needs were in there, and they weren't always. It wasn't always so compatible.
I mean, I think there's larger questions. Going back to what Roger was speaking to a few minutes ago, you're getting into the critical disability zone. What is the purpose of education? What is the purpose of parenting? I don't think there's troubled children. I think when we have a child who's maybe being violent or not sitting still or not doing whatever it is that's our agenda, we've failed the kid because the kid
I
is
agree.
trying to, clearly
Mhm.
communicate that whatever's going on is not working for them. So I think like that's what I keep saying. It's all this is an opportunity to sit down and
Mhm.
ask those really hard questions. And you're right. I think in the past, we weren't asking those questions, right? We just threw all the kids who couldn't meet our agenda into a room, left them there,
Exactly.
and that was that. So and I think that is where the neurodiversity movement should get a lot of credit, because even though it's arguably imperfect and still being theorized and has caused some tension in some ways, it has really pushed that conversation to start asking those questions. Like whenever I'm working with teachers and training teachers, um, they'll say something like, "Oh, well, this kid doesn't sit still." Well, who came up with the idea that a kid is supposed to sit still for 7 hours a day? I mean, that's question one, and then they'll say, "Oh, well, uh, he can't do tests." Well, um, why is that the only way to show what you know? You know, so this is what I'm saying. If we can just keep asking those questions, and I don't necessarily always have the answers, but it's that commitment to asking. I think that's really valuable.
I was really lucky that I had teachers that did that. They just said, well, if you are not good at doing it this way, then let's find another way. And
That is lucky.
yes, it was very lucky because that wasn't the norm.
Emotional regulation kind of filters in too. Like you're saying, you think there's no such thing as a bad kid, and the adults have failed the kid, but sometimes a child and adults have trouble with emotional regulation, and that doesn't, or hadn't in the past, got the acknowledgement and the attention that it should have. And even to this day, I don't really think they do much to teach kids about how to calm themselves down when they're nervous, and we get a lot of blame for not knowing how to do stuff. But I mean, I'm very trauma informed, and I know when the amygdala is doing its thing, the hippocampus, which is your rational brain, that shuts down. So and this is like a survival thing that we inherited, as a species, to escape the saber-toothed tiger or whatever, the danger was, but it's still, with us very much to this day. So if your amygdala is going off and your hippocampus is shut down, then you're not making the best judgments, and that's where you've got those quote unquote problem behaviors. And then the child gets blamed for that, when in fact that's really not anything that's a conscious choice or in someone's conscious control at the time. And I think there needs to be a lot more understanding, and everywhere. It's not just in schools, but everywhere. It's about, how that part of the, like trauma theory comes into play with all of this.
Yes, thank you for adding that in. I didn't mean to imply, if I did by accident, that kids don't have any problems. There are kids who have some pretty significant problems, like you said, like with the self-regulation, it can be very difficult to stay calm and whatnot. I just meant that if we blame the kid and we say, oh, this kid won't behave, this kid won't sit still, this kid cries over the minor issue, like that's what I meant when I said we're feeling that, because it's
right. I got that. I got that. Oh, and I also want to say that, like, I know for myself personally, part of my poor emotional regulation is due because of my sensory issues. I have very severe sensory sensitivities, and that causes a tremendous amount of anxiety when I can't escape a situation. Like when you have to sit still and be quiet and all that. Like if I'm in a seminar and there's an alarm going off or something, it's like the amygdala just kicks in because my sensory, it's painful, and it causes that kind of a reaction.
that's why people are saying, like what we need to do is like fix the world instead of constantly always blaming and fixing autistic people. Well, now autistic people may want help, like if there is something that could, calm sensory issues or something like that. So I'm not against that avenue either. But for example, you mentioned like alarms going off at a conference or something like that. We don't have to. We can make more sensory friendly classrooms, we can make sensory friendly movie theaters, we can do so much in this world, and then autistic people might not have so much trouble,
or change the tone and pitch of the alarms.
and that's another, there's a lot of options. So just keeping that in mind, that sometimes you change the society and autistic people wouldn't have so much trouble.
And it's not just autistic people. I mean, people with like ADHD have these sensory issues. People who've been traumatized have these sensory issues.
Yes.
It would make the world a better place all around for everyone if people could just be more understanding of it.
I was going to ACA meetings, Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunction, and to my amazement, most people had to learn about feelings. Somehow or other, because maybe you were in trauma or whatever, but most people had to go ahead and go all the way back through the emotions to be able to feel again and learn to feel. I'm not saying that right, but
yes, you are.
But
anyone in that kind of situation has childhood trauma.
Yeah. But
the trauma shuts down the feeling, because they learn from a young age that feeling isn't safe.
And whether you're given supports or not, it really plays a huge role in your experience of your disability.
It's still a tough one to mention to a doctor, because then they just want to label you.
And I hope that this conversation was, interesting, useful, maybe gave you some things to think about, that it's not you being bad or your disability being so horrible. We need a more supportive world. And
now, I did have one thing I wanted to say, Zosia, is like, have you heard of this thing called I think it's called the primary attribution error?
I have. What are you thinking about it?
I'm thinking like, well, it's supposedly this kind of human tendency, and I'm not sure why it exists, but I guess if this is people's tendency, to just blame the person rather than situational things, that would explain a behavior or something that's happening. I guess getting people to entertain change would be getting them to, I guess, acknowledge that we're all sort of we can all be, susceptible to jumping to the incorrect conclusions, as this phenomenon might accept, and I guess people just have such a hard time accepting, fessing up or owning any flaws they might have.
Well, yeah, I think a couple of things there, just maybe some concluding things to think about. You're right, human brains are very judgmental. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It keeps us alive, right? Poisonous food, not poisonous food. Good place to, put your house, bad place to put your house, it's gonna flood. So we make judgments all the time that help us like stay alive. The problem comes to pass when we're making judgments about other people based on their identity. And that is where we get into trouble. And yeah, those judgments can happen very quickly. They often happen on layers of our brain that we're not consciously aware of. So most of you probably sitting here would say, I'm not racist, but when they do studies of, they call it implicit bias because you can't see it. It's embedded inside of you. So we all have racism, sexism, ableism, all these isms in us because of how we've been socialized. Will human beings ever reach a point where we're not judgmental at all? No. And that wouldn't work because, like I said, judgment keeps us alive. The issue, again, is when we're making judgments based on who somebody is, on their identity, and then constraining opportunities based on that conclusion. And that I do think we can disrupt. And we can say, look, it's good to gather information and to be curious and to make discernments. But when it comes to human beings, we can make a society, a culture that inculcates a skill in us that when we encounter a different kind of human being, instead of leaping to different bad, we leap to different curious. I do think that that's very possible. So that's maybe a good point to end on.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point to end on, is that, knowing when to use things, when not to use things, knowing the difference. And I think that's something that that's a realistic ask for most people.
So yeah, so on that note, keep being like, oh, different, curious.
Great. Well, Zosia, thank you so much. And I mean, there's so many things you mentioned that I think warrant more discussion. If you're willing to come back, we would so much love for you to come back, and maybe we can have a more narrow focus to do a deeper dive in some of these really important issues.
And whatever works, I'm happy to jump in again in the future.
It's a pleasure meeting you.
It was nice meeting all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.